we talk about, do you love your life? Do you love yourself? And love often seems like, oh, everything's great. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of what is love, love is surrounding what's broken.
Welcome to Heal, a podcast about the real stories of what it takes to heal. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Marshall, naturopathic physician, published author, and psychedelic integration guide. What does it really take to heal? We sit down for raw, authentic conversations from science to spirit, trauma to transformation. If you want to learn more, go to my website, sarahmarshallnd.com, and sign up for my newsletter, where I share my most cutting-edge new thinking, what I'm seeing right now in the research and in my clinical practice. So you're getting the most up-to-date information, practical tools in your inbox. Check us out, join us, and enjoy the show. I love this process because we're getting all the wiggles out and getting ready to be here together. It's awesome. Jennifer Granata, thank you so much for being here on Heal. And we set this up to be a turning the tables. You were going to interview me. And then as we were preparing for it, I was like, oh no, this is going to be mutually contributing, mutually beneficial. You have so much to bring to this conversation about adrenal fatigue and what it is to be on a long chronic disease healing journey that I look very, very much look forward to the questions you're going to ask me. And I also can't wait to see how it all, because you have so much to contribute. So thank you so much for being here and doing this with me.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be a part of this. We've been working together for 11 years now.
Yeah.
And that, I guess that's kind of a perfect way to start. So 11 years ago, I was diagnosed with adrenal fatigue. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, I have what? So I'd never heard of it before. And tell us, what is adrenal fatigue?
So it's one of those terms that you'll hear. You can Google it, you look it up on the internet. It's more prevalent in the conversation today than it was 11 years ago, and definitely more so than 20 years ago, when the first time I encountered it in med school. But what adrenal fatigue is referring to is a more naturopathic or functional medicine diagnosis of a dysfunction of your adrenal glands regulation of the hormones in your body. So the adrenal glands are two little glands that sit on top of your kidneys. So they're like basically right in the middle of your back, just below the low back, below the floating ribs. And they control blood sugar and sex is the way to remember it. So they control blood pressure along with the kidneys and the lungs. There's hormone secretion from all three of those organs. And they control blood sugar by supporting your liver when you haven't eaten over a long period of time and you're not about to eat something. Your body keeps blood sugar elevated by cortisol releasing from the adrenals that tells the liver to release glucagon. Glucagon releases the glucose storage in your body, and you maintain a level of blood sugar. And then sex, there's actually some level of estrogen and progesterone and testosterone secretion from your adrenal glands, particularly important post-andropause, post-menopause, when the testes and the ovaries are done and they're retired, their job is complete of procreation. Any level of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone we have in the body is coming from the adrenal glands. So what a lot of people deal with post-menopausal, we tend to focus on the ovaries, but it's really an issue with the adrenal glands. So when we as naturopathic physicians or functional medicine doctors or integrative physicians, who's typically who you would ever hear this from, say adrenal fatigue, what we mean is really hypopituitary adrenal axis dysfunction, or HPA-Axis dysfunction. That's the more physiologic, medically accurate way of saying it. The hypothalamus and the pituitary are parts of your brain that are controlling and regulating blood sugar, controlling and regulating your hunger levels, metabolism. The pituitary is the part of the brain that specifically, not the only center, but it's the main center, telling your adrenals to secrete cortisol, telling your thyroid to secrete thyroid hormone, and telling your ovaries to secrete estrogen, progesterone. Women, a little bit of testosterone. Men, testosterone, a little bit of estrogen and progesterone. So The pituitary gland and the hypothalamus are actually regulating what's happening in the rest of your body hormonally. And then that axis, the way you may have heard like the gut brain axis, right? Where your gut system and your digestive system and the microbiome are talking back up to the brain. We have the same thing in the hormone and the endocrine system. So the tricky bit with adrenal fatigue is that it's not commonly accepted as an actual accurate medical diagnosis. So what it's referring to can be a broad range of syndrome being a collection of symptoms versus a disease that it's a very specific physical state. Syndromes are things where we can't quite nail down what the specific physical state is, but there's common symptoms that everybody that has this syndrome has. And in adrenal fatigue, you can have everything from stage 1 to stage 3 is the common way we talk about it. There's another table where it actually has 7 stages of adrenal fatigue and recovery laid out. Mostly we talk about the 3 stages. The first stage is the alarm stage. And this comes from, I'm see if I get his name right. I think it's Hans Stiles' adaptive stress response. And we will make sure that that is correct in the show notes. Where when you're under acute stress, you break your leg. And now you have this injury and your body goes into an extreme response to heal the broken leg. You have a big upswing of cortisol in your body in order to make sure that you function during this emergency. Sometimes acute stresses can last days to weeks, but they typically complete in a short period of time. You can be in a flu, COVID, an acute infectious state, you get really bad food poisoning, right? Something like that. Your body's going to be in this acute stress response. And then normally the stress goes away, it's complete, you recover, you go back to normal, your cortisol levels come down, your DHEA levels come down, which is another hormone we'll talk more about that's connected to this. But what happens for many of us is the stress doesn't go away. Because it wasn't a broken leg. It was our job. It was our career. It was our marriage. It is our just general way of adapting to life. Now that we're learning more about trauma and complex PTSD, there's a whole interrelationship, which I'm sure we'll get into today, about the nervous system and constantly being on hyper alert for threats in our environment based on how we were raised and whatever our adaptive adult is dealing with from trauma that keeps people stuck in a stress response, and the adrenals are constantly working all the time. So then you can have stage 2 adrenal fatigue where you're now starting to get some decompensation. You're actually having maybe your cortisol levels are still high, but your DHE levels are dropping. More commonly, you'll actually have DHEA levels still up there and the cortisol level starts dropping. This can all be seen on specific tests that we'll also talk about today. And then stage 3 is exhaustion, where all levels are starting to bottom out and they're well below physiologic normal. I'm going to pause there and let you ask more questions so I don't just keep answering things as we go, right? Yeah.
There's so much. There's so much. And I think that's the big thing about it, that there is so much to this. And it's constantly evolving as medicine learns more about it. But I find for myself, I'm officially 11 years into this journey. But as I began to learn about the symptoms, the stressors, the triggers, I realized I've actually been on this journey for 33 years. I had my first episode when I was 22, and I had no idea that that's what it was. So maybe from here, let's talk about, you mentioned some of the tests, right? So how do you determine that what you're dealing with is adrenal fatigue? And you talked about the 3 stages. At what stage can you actually be diagnosed? When can you get a correct diagnosis? So tell me about, because I know what a couple of the tests that we've done for me, but tell
Yeah.
her.
Definitely. So what's most commonly accepted as the best test for getting a more complete picture of what all of your hormones, but particularly cortisol and DHEA, which are the ones we're most concerned about with the adrenals at this point, is actually saliva and urine metabolites. So you can test cortisol in blood, and it's not a bad idea to at least get a baseline run. And typically what you'll see if you ask your primary care physician and say, hey, I think I'm dealing with some fatigue issues, more often what they'll do is test your thyroid, and they'll typically only test thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH. And then if TSH is considered abnormal outside of the lab levels, then they will do a reflexive T4 test, which is the storage tank of thyroid hormone. As an aside, I have all my clients do a complete thyroid panel if they're dealing with fatigue. And then you'll also typically have a doctor that would be willing to look for anemia. So they're going to look at your red blood cells. They're going to look at your iron count. That's typically where we go with fatigue. It's much less common that someone will think of the adrenal glands. But more and more it's happening. And so they might run an adrenal test where you get your cortisol tested as a morning cortisol. You go into the blood lab. First thing in the morning, you're fasting, you're going to do a full panel, and they'll do a single cortisol test just to see, do you have cortisol at all? The tricky bit about getting the blood test done, one, that is not your normal state. You got up, you got ready for an appointment, you didn't eat because you know you shouldn't eat because you're fasting for the rest of the test, and then you drove somewhere, then you got to the lab, and then you got your cortisol level tested. A lot of the most important information of how your adrenals are doing actually happens from the moment you wake up till 60 minutes after you woke up. In that first hour you're awake, we get so much data. You can't even get to a lab in order to test that. You'd have to do home, like finger stick tests, which now that I'm saying that, probably somebody either has that test or should have that test, where you could do finger stick tests at home. But mostly what we do is actually salivary testing. And then if you add urine metabolites to the test, I'll tell you why that's really helpful. So what we've found in the research, and this is all backed by scientific research, and there are many lab companies out there that I don't have any strong affiliation with, but I'll tell you a couple of them. ZRT Lab does this. Precision Analytical does the Dutch test, which is the one that I run the most. I think Doctors Data also does it. I mean, there really are a bunch of lab companies out there that have got decades and decades and decades of doing this work and seeing how it correlates to our actual functional hormone levels. The saliva seems to be a better indicator of what's happening at the tissues. The way that I explain this is like, if you want to study a population of a city, and the only thing you do is watch how many cars are on the highway, you're going to get an idea of how many people live in that city, but you really have no idea what's happening in the houses, the homes, the apartment buildings, you don't know what's going on in the neighborhoods. Now, the more cars that are on the highways, probably the more people that are living in the houses, and the less cars that are on the highways, probably the less people that are in the houses. But I don't know, maybe it's a pandemic. And then all of the arteries, all of the highways are empty. There's no cars, there's no hormones or blood flowing through the arteries where you would do from a blood test, but yet they're all hanging out in their houses and they're all in their tissues, or vice versa. Something happened, the biggest event of the year, everybody's on the highway and all the houses are empty. So this is the equivalent of, if we only ever do blood tests, all we're ever doing is looking at what's going on the highways. We don't really know what's going on in the houses or the tissue sites, where the actual hormones are, quite frankly, the most commonly found and the most commonly active. So like, we're talking about adrenals, but the same goes for sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone. Most of your hormones are made by your ovaries or your testes at the local site, being used by cells in their local neighborhood. They never even have to get on the highway. They can do all their job from the house that they were born in, walk around the neighborhood, do their thing, go back to the house. Like, I love this analogy. I'm going to go very far with it, but it helps you picture it, right? So when we test only hormones in blood testing, we're missing a whole aspect of what might be going on in somebody. So we found saliva to be better. It's also very easy to do, and you can do it at home.
Another question on that brings that up, or what that brings up for me is, one thing I learned with the saliva test is that my cortisol levels change throughout the day.
Yeah. Yep. So that's the other piece here too. So the other piece I want to put in, because I mentioned it, is the urine metabolites. So, and when you do these home, they're called diurnal cortisol testing or diurnal hormone testing. Diurnal as in fluctuates throughout the day. You have a circadian rhythm. One of the big components of why you have a circadian rhythm is because your cortisol, first thing in the morning, you wake up, it's at a baseline level. And then 30 minutes later after waking, you should have your highest level of cortisol for the day. It peaks. And then another 30 minutes after waking, it's already falling off pretty considerably. The steepness of that peak tells me a lot of things. If it jumps really high in a very sharp edge, you are in the first stage of adrenal fatigue. You're in alarm phase. Your body's in high alert. You're dealing with a major stress. And usually when people wake up in the morning, when they have that, they wake up in a state of anxiety. They're already kind of fritzy. Those are the people that are like, I do drink coffee, but it makes me super wired, right? They feel heart palpitations. They feel their heartbeat. They feel jittery. There's like, and maybe even some of them, the way that they've already learned to take care of it is they immediately go outside and go for a run. They have to burn off energy. Then that curve goes back down. And then for the rest of the day, it's continuing to diminish till it gets to its low point. This isn't true for everybody's circadian rhythm, but theoretically, if you wake up at 6:30, you get your peak at 7 a.m., and then slowly it'll decline throughout the afternoon to its low point around 7 p.m. When your cortisol goes low, that's the trigger for melatonin to start to get made, beginning to make you sleepy. And then your melatonin levels will come up, and that's the other half of your diurnal rhythm. Then you fall asleep, 9:30 or 10, and the whole system starts over again in the morning. What the urine metabolites do is they let us know how much hormone you're making at all. So you can have, and I've had clients, and this is a different part of the different stages, where their salivary cortisol is very low. It's not registering as sufficient, and their urine metabolites are very high. So if you're making the hormone, you're going to pee it out. It will be in your urine. Why would you have low tissue level and high in your urine for that same time mark? Well, it's because you're burning the fuel very quickly. This is somebody who's been longer term chronic stress, but they're not totally diminished yet. Their body's coping in a way. There's usually a lot of symptoms at this point, but they don't feel good, but they're also not like, I had to quit my job and I can't get out of bed. They're not at that level yet, but they're definitely like wired and tired. I have to run on caffeine. I notice I'm sensitive to light. I'm sensitive to sound. I notice that I'm constantly craving carbohydrates and I have a lot of blood sugar instability. I get hangry really easily. There's a whole sequence of symptoms that come up for people in this stage. And if we never did the urine metabolites, what you would see is only the low cortisol, and we would mistreat it by hyperinflating the body, putting too much push on making more cortisol. They're making the cortisol. Their body is burning it out and not using it efficiently. So the treatment would change completely in that case.
Great. Great. Now, it's so great that you brought up the symptoms too. Are the symptoms common? Like what symptoms tend to go with which stages? And I know there's a huge number, so we don't have to include them all, but you mentioned some. Which ones tend to, so again, how would I even know that I needed to get tested?
Yeah.
Right?
Let's go back to that part. I mean, to be completely honest, every single client that walks in my door, I have 3 standard test panels I do with everybody. And this is one of them. The other ones is I do some sort of either a GI map or GI-FX gut test that lets me know how their microbiome's doing, do they have gut inflammation, and how they're digesting their food. And then I always do a full standard blood panel that's like what you typically would get, your red blood cells, white blood cells, your blood chemistry, but I do a bit more of that. And we actually did a podcast a couple of years ago that I'll make sure is in the show notes for this, that we went through all what my top labs are and why I do them. So why would you get tested? To be completely honest, because you're an American, somewhere between the ages of 35 and 70, I pretty much guarantee you've got some, and at least it's one of those where like, so, if we look at what's going on Instagram and social media and like the world of kind of the conversations, there's so much talk about bioidentical hormones. And I think I'm mostly for it, but I think we could do a little bit better nuances and kind of make sure that we're saying it clearly. And one of the things that I do not like at all is when the adrenals are ignored and someone gets put on bioidentical hormones, because basically what we've done is put jet fuel in a crashing airplane. That is not good for people. I
If
think you had an experience with this, didn't
yes,
you?
I
Yeah.
was gonna share that, because not only that, but it didn't work.
Nope.
So one of
It
the
usually.
things for me, and I was probably into stage 3 at this point, and for me, it was my menstrual cycle was all out of whack. I remember there was this one over like a 3-month period. I would bleed for 10 days, really heavy, and then I would stop for 2 weeks and then bleed for 10 days and stop for 2 weeks. Like it was crazy. So my endocrinologist put me on progesterone, and to try to ease the bleeding. And he just kept putting me on higher and higher doses. And if anything, it made it worse. And so it was, yeah, it was one of those things of like, what is going on in my body? And I thought I was in early menopause.
So glad you said. I just wrote that down. I was like, talk about early menopause.
Yeah, because
Uh-huh.
I think I was in my early 40s at that point. And actually, as I had read about menopause, I thought, so even going, years before I was diagnosed, I thought I was starting early menopause when I was 36. And looking back, I can see the symptoms, right? And so, yeah, so I definitely had that issue. And even with, as we talk about the endocrine issues, I have hypothyroidism too, which also went undiagnosed until I was 40, 41. Um, and even trying all the different hormones, I've been on maybe 4 different thyroid hormones, and only one of them works for me. So I guess even that, maybe, I don't know if that's telling. And I'm on very high doses. So when I was initially diagnosed and they were putting me on micrograms, which did nothing, and I'm on 120 milligrams, and I've been on up to 180 milligrams of of the of the thyroid hormone. So it's interesting.
So I'm glad you said all that because it's a little hard to me. Like, I don't want to just rattle off memorize list of symptoms, right? That's not that helpful. But as you're talking, I'm like, okay, here's some places. So
Right.
how would you know you even want to investigate this, right? Well, one is anyone who's hyperthyroid
Oh,
because
hyper or hypo?
hypothyroid. Thank you. Although if you're hyperthyroid, you want to protect your adrenals because hyperthyroid can burn the adrenals out. That can be one of the sources, but that's more just like getting enough herbal support and making sure that you're taking care of your whole endocrine system. But hypothyroid. So one of the biggest causes of hypothyroidism is adrenal fatigue, but it always goes on or unlocked. So typically the adrenal symptoms predate the thyroid symptoms. Most people. I don't know what the exact ratio is. If I was going to throw a dart at a number, I'd say it's at least 60-40. That 60% of the time people with hypothyroidism, that diagnosis is about 8 to 10 years after I could go back in their timeline and find there were issues with adrenal dysregulation. Why is that? So here's another analogy for you. The way I like to talk about the endocrine system is that you have, imagine old school like horse cart riders and horse cart races. So you'd have a driver sitting on top of a small cart and then a like thoroughbred racehorse, right? The racehorse is your thyroid. It is your metabolism. It is your energy level. It is your drive forward. It is literally your get up and go. It is your ability to just go in a direction and maintain stamina that way. The cart is your ovaries, or in men's, for men, it's your testes. And then the driver is your adrenal glands. So the driver is kind of the brains of the operation. The adrenal glands are all about fight, flight, or freeze. The adrenal glands are all about dealing with trauma, dealing with threats, physical threats, emotional threats, perceived threat. The threat doesn't even have to actually be happening, but your body, like imagine if anyone wants to know what is that feeling of cortisol, you're on the highway, you're going 75 miles an hour, and suddenly the car in front of you throws on its brakes and you see all the brake lights out in front of you and you like slam on your brakes and you get that tingly rush through your whole body. That was cortisol. So when you're this is a little bit hard to say it this way. I'm going to say it wrong. Our bodies were designed. I don't know that that's quite how that worked, but it was like the adrenal glands design is that you need them 4 to 5 times in a lifetime. And so if you think about the way our lives probably were as hunter-gatherers and the millennia of human evolution before 2,000, 4,000 years ago, even in the last 1,000 years, things picked up a lot. In the last 500 years, we've had massive changes, So if you go back 500 years, 1,000 years, but definitely you go back 4,000 years, the human body, our physiology, which has not genetically changed that much in 4,000 years, we would have been living within walking distance of where we were born. We would have been with the same 100 to 120 people that we'd known our entire lives. Not much changed. Even if we were a migratory tribe or group of people, there was a well-worn pattern of this is the way my ancestors did it. This is the way we've always done it. There was an immense sense of belonging, safety, and familiarity. None of us have that anymore. We're immigrants. We came from other places. I mean, I've literally moved 30 times in my adult life. I've had massive reinventions of my friends group. I have gone to lots of different cultures. I mean, I love that. My adrenal glands do not love that at all. So they're really not designed to be relied on as much as we do. And so it's easy to burn them out. What happens is if you're a workaholic, driven, double, triple major in college, getting your PhD, if you're running your own business on the side, if you're, have that driven type A personality, hyper vigilant, or spreadsheet people, you know who you are, that tends to be my adrenal fatigue people. Adrenals are all about survival, and they come online when we're 2 years old with the kidneys. So they actually come online fully developed before the thyroid. The thyroid comes online with the GI tract at about 4 years old. We have to have functioning kidney detox and functioning adrenal glands before we ever even get very far into life. And if people have kidney failure, you're going to be dead soon without a kidney transplant or dialysis. And if you have complete adrenal failure, which I know this will be a question we're going to get into, with Cushing's disease and Addison's disease, which is the actual disease states of your adrenals are either hyperactive and flooding your body with cortisol, or they're completely kaput and you do not have the ability to make cortisol. Those are the only two recognized diagnoses by common medical doctors. But there's this range of adrenal dysfunction between Cushing's disease, excess cortisol, and Addison's disease where you don't have any. So the thyroid, I swear, I'm going to get back to it. What happens is that your adrenals come on at 2 years old and you're immediately scanning the world for threats. The threat might be my sister stealing my toy, but you're like, that's my toy. It can come from lots of places. Mostly it gets more in the realm of when we get an experience of our life being threatened, whatever that means to us at that age, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. When we've lived in this hyper alert state, when we've been raised in families where being hyper vigilant was how we survived, being very hypercritical, paying attention to everything, fine tuning to all the details, we take that into adulthood. And eventually, some of us, it was in our 20s. I was 25 and my adrenals were already smoked. Some of us, it comes a little later, but at some point, the body's like, we cannot keep going like this, or she's going to run herself literally into the pavement. So the thyroid intentionally ramps itself down. Like the horse is like, no more. The driver's up there just whipping and whipping and whipping and triple majors and PhDs and jobs on the side and all the things that we were doing, you and I. And the thyroid just finally basically turns around and says, fuck you, I'm not doing it anymore. And you'll get a hypothyroid physiologic state. It's almost as if the body's trying to protect itself from complete and total crash and burnout. So that I see a lot. And people come in on the thyroid meds that are either not working or not working as well as we want them to. They're not really dealing, or, autoimmune thyroid is a slightly different process, but it has similar relationship. And we then end up where I go looking for adrenal fatigue. So that's one of the big areas that I'd say. A couple others I want to mention are chronic low blood pressure. people will tell me I just have low blood pressure. I stand up quickly and the lights go out. I feel dizzy. Now POTS is the actual postural orthostatic hypertension is the way I got taught it, but POTS is what we'll hear, which has happened a lot post-COVID and post-COVID vaccine injury. You'll have also chronic low blood sugar. So for many of us, before diabetes sets in, you actually deal with low blood sugar, where it's like you're hangry all the time. You've got to eat frequently. I remember I used to tell boyfriends in college, like, if I get really irritable and grumpy, just don't talk to me. Take out a granola bar, open my mouth, shove it in, pat me on the head, and 20 minutes later, I'll be a normal human being again. Because at that time, nobody knew whatever, but I was vegetarian my whole upbringing, and I'm an obligate type O carnivore, should have been eating meat and fat that whole time. So my blood sugar was a mess. And I would literally live off of like ruby red grapefruit juice, ice cream, bagels, pasta, granola bars. I mean, there was sugar all over my diet in college. And it's just how I fueled myself to be able to keep going. I had no idea that I was dealing with adrenal issues. I did know I had low blood sugar. My mom had low blood sugar. So we kind of had this like, oh, maybe it's genetic. But I also had low blood pressure as well, where you get dizzy really easily upon standing and you just kind of feel ungrounded. And then this other piece of early menopause. Oh, the things I could say. I'm going to be really bold here, but basically I'm going to say there's no such thing as early menopause. There are a few people that have primary ovarian failure, where their ovaries literally stop producing estrogen and progesterone in their 30s, and there's usually a very specific cause to that. What we call early menopause, where people in their late 30s or early 40s are starting to miss periods or have a very short cycle, or they're only bleeding for a day or two, or they have massively irregular cycle and all their hormones seemingly are diminished. And especially if they at least run blood tests and they see you have diminished estrogen and progesterone, that's now like the cart has been being dragged by the horse, been dragged by the driver, and the wheels are finally falling off. But it's not really the cart's fault. It's been literally dragged through life. And so that's another big red flag for me of going hunting for cortisol and adrenal imbalances.
So much.
I know. I don't like talking about this subject at all. Nothing to say here.
So one thing that where I'm going to go from here. Well, I guess there are two things I want to say about this. We started out talking about the symptoms, but ended up talking more about the hormone side. I guess one of the things in terms of the symptoms that I really discovered is kind of the simple way to go about it is, once I started looking at and learning about what do the adrenal glands produce and what are the different parts of my body that are being controlled and supported by the adrenal glands. And then if I look at, okay, it's my energy throughout the day, am I fatigued, and at what points during the day? Another thing you said about the cortisol, oh, you actually didn't say this, but one of the things we've talked about in our past is how with dysfunction, just when you need sleep the most,
insomnia,
because the cortisol goes up at the end of the day instead of down.
The second wind syndrome.
Yeah. So that piece, you talked about sensitivity to light, sensitivity to sound, and that's another piece I discovered, that the aldosterone, right? Is not an aldosterone.
And aldosterone specifically is often involved with blood pressure, but it also can have to do with the sensitivity as well.
Right. It's one of the things that I read as I was reading about that was aldosterone is responsible for how our sodium and potassium are balanced, and how our irises respond to light.
The aurora sign. Yep.
Yeah, that's based on our sodium potassium balance. So, when we talk about sodium, right, and going on a low sodium diet, I mean, for me, I had to be adding salt and adding salt and adding salt.
Yep. Yeah. And
to
salt craving is another symptom. People are like, yeah, I mean, some people go for the sugar for the simple hit of the energy, right? Or the carbs. But some people, it's not sugar. They go for the potato chips. It's still the carbs, but then it's the carbs plus the salt. And like, you know who you are, the ones that you can get that bag of sea salt vinegar potato chips and like it's gone in 30 minutes. I get it where like the roof of my mouth is scraped up and it like burns, but at the same time, I'm like, don't care all the way down. Yeah. That's a
there are those of us who've discovered how to get them together with like dark chocolate covered pretzel.
Yeah, totally. Like, let's mix and match here.
Well, yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
exactly. Get the sugar and the salt and the
Yeah.
simple carbs simultaneously. Yeah. Okay. Well,
While we're talking about it, I want to put in so old school back in the day when we would do just physical exams and not rely so much on laboratory diagnosis for everything, there were two key tests that we would do to look into the adrenal function. One is the aurora sign. So the pupils, the dilation and constriction of your pupils are controlled by ciliary muscles, and those ciliary muscles have a direct connection to adrenal gland dysfunction. It's interesting because actually, when you look in Chinese medicine, there is no adrenal meridian, but it's like the adrenal glands are sitting on the kidneys. So you can kind of put a lot of kidney function related to the adrenal glands, although it's not that simple. There's also triple warmer, and there's a couple other places where the glandular function of the body fits in. But one aspect that I find interesting is the kidney meridian actually runs all the way up into the eyes, and the kidneys very much control eyesight. And so I do think that that's part of the pathway relationship. Why do the adrenal glands have an impact on how your pupils dilate? But they do. And when somebody's been in adrenal fatigue for a long period of time, if they're stage 2 or stage 3, what you do is you put your hand in front of their nose and block one eye, and you shine a light into their eye, and the pupils will constrict very briefly. And then the more fatigued they are, the faster it starts to go wah, 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 wah. And it like wiggles. It's like the muscles are trembling and they can't hold the pupil closed. And then they just open up. And that's where the light sensitivity comes from, is literally your pupils are not able to stay constricted to protect you from bright sunlight. So wearing sunglasses on cloudy days, there was in my 20s, I wore sunglasses the minute I walked out of the house. It didn't matter what was going on. And for some people, it gets so bad, they have to wear some form of sunglasses inside, in even being under fluorescent lights. And there can be different times. I know you dealt with that.
yes.
So that was one test. And then the other was testing for POTS, or testing for orthostatic hypotension. So you lay somebody down completely flat on a like massage table or an exam table, and you take their blood pressure laying down. Then you stand them up and take their blood pressure again fairly quickly. And what should happen to a normal healthy person is when you stand up, your blood pressure goes up by the systolic, the top number should go up by at least 10 points, maybe even more. And that's your body putting pressure in the system so that your blood stays in your head when you stand up really quickly. Somebody that's dealing with adrenal issues or HPA-Axis dysfunction, what's going to happen is they stand up. Sometimes the blood pressure goes down from what it was laying down, or it stays the same with minimal change. And you have underreactive hormones that are not able to keep the system pressurized. So I used to do those back in the day when I had a physical clinic. I used to do those tests on my clients just in office. We didn't even necessarily go into the lab testing.
Oh, that's, yeah. All of that is just so familiar to me. Now, as you talked about the carbohydrates, another thing you mentioned earlier, and one of the things you and I have been talking about, is protein and the importance of protein and what type of protein in in healing and in recovery. And before we get into this, this is one of those things, as I look back on my life and I see those spots where it's like, oh, I guess I was in having adrenal issues then. But I've also been a carb junkie all my life, and definitely always would be craving bread, pasta, like all of that. And that's always what I reached for. And for me, when I was 30, my metabolism shifted. I gained a lot of weight. And so I went on Weight Watchers to try to lose the weight. And I did. But one of the things that was great about that was they had all these different um, like surveys or tests that you do online. And one of the things that I discovered there was the carb, when I did the carb craving one, the response came back, you need to eat more protein. It's like, what? So, and this was 25 years ago that I started learning this. And, and here we are again. And then when I began really understanding this journey and my recovery journey, it was focused on the protein. And here we are again talking about it. And now, you're talking more about the fat too, because 11 years ago, I was focused on the lean protein. And in our last session a month ago, like, nope, you need the fats. So like, well, there goes any weight loss for right now. But but with all that, let's talk about the protein and fat and like what the body needs. How do you start? So, okay, so now we've talked about what are some of the symptoms, and we could probably do a whole session just
on that, right? Yeah.
What adrenal fatigue is, how you might get diagnosed, and let's start talking a little bit about the recovery. And certainly, I've learned so much about what I put into my body plays a big part in the recovery. And before we get into the protein too, let's talk a little bit about food allergies and food sensitivities as in terms of stress. So let's talk about how do you start? One of the things is diet, right? Or nutrition. Let's talk about that in terms of both how that contributes to adrenal fatigue, how it contributes to recovery, and how do you begin looking at that?
Good. So what this makes me think of, and I don't have it right here when I'm working with clients, I actually pull up this little cartoon that I've used for 2 decades of education that is a little adrenal gland. It's like this little triangular lump that has an A on its chest and like cartoon eyes and hands and feet. And it says what stresses out the adrenal glands. And then there's this whole circle around the entire thing that is like trauma, relationship stress, money stress, job loss, chemical stress, physical stress, injury, food sensitivities, caffeine, sugar. Like it's just like this. And everyone looks at it and they're like, well, that's most of my life. Right. And you're like, okay, it can seem a little bit like, is there any way out of this? Right. So one of the first places I start with anybody in recovery is diet. And the reason is because one of the main jobs that the adrenal glands does just in daily physiology, other than it like wakes us up and gets us going in the morning. So another symptom that people come in with adrenal symptoms is they wake up in the morning and they have to drag themselves into their day. And it takes a very long time for them to get going in the morning. So that's another hint. That there's something going on with your cortisol levels. You probably have a more flat curve. You're not getting that peak that's getting you up and going in the morning. So, but day to day, the adrenals are useful, even though I said like that extreme emergency cortisol situation is only really supposed to happen maybe 4 or 5 times in a lifetime. And we do that 4 or 5 times in the first 10 years of our life, right? But there is a daily function, and part of the daily function is managing our blood sugar. When we've been under adrenal stress for a long period of time and we're dealing with some sort of HPA-Axis dysfunction, what happens is you eat food, your body starts digesting it. It takes about an hour to go through the stomach, and now it's hitting the small intestine, and all the circulation around the small intestine is starting to absorb that nutrition, and your blood sugar is rising. Typically, blood sugar peaks somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours after you've eaten. So that's when insulin gets secreted by your pancreas and starts sequestering all of that blood sugar away into the cells where it can be used. Then it's 2 hours after you've eaten and you haven't eaten anything else, and now your blood sugar is starting to drop. And there's a certain set point that your brain requires to function of a certain amount of blood sugar. That's the main reason why we need our blood sugar to be at a set level, is to keep the lights on up here. Your brain is a very energetically hungry organ. 30 to 60% of your calories every day go just to feeding your brain, depending on your level of activity that day of braining. So I always was amazed how in med school, I did nothing but sit in dark rooms in lecture halls and learn stuff. And I could eat like 2,500 to 3,000 calories and not gain a thing because it was going to my brain. And another symptom, brain fog, difficulty concentrating. Right. ADD gets worse with adrenal fatigue. So when somebody's dealing with ADD or ADHD, that's another thing that when someone walks in with any kind of ADD, ADHD, I'm already thinking adrenal dysfunction. Not that it's the cause of it, but people who deal with ADD and ADHD tend to take the habits that make it worse for the adrenals. They don't eat, they skip meals, they live on caffeine, they hop from one thing to another, they live in a bit of emergency state because they feel they're always behind on things. All of that's very hard on the adrenals. And when the adrenals aren't functioning well, it makes the symptoms and the challenges that people with neuroatypia have much worse. So here we are now, 2 hours we haven't eaten, our blood sugar is dropping. Naturally, what would happen in a stable human being that doesn't have this issue is the liver secretes glucagon. That's the opposite of insulin. That's the one that goes, knocks on all the doors of the cells and says, release the blood sugar and allow it to come back into circulation to go to other places. 4 hours after not eating, if you still haven't eaten anything and your blood sugar starts dropping again, the adrenal glands secrete cortisol that goes and knocks on the door of the liver and says, hey, we're not done yet. She still hasn't fucking eaten anything. And then the glucagon comes out again and the cycle starts again for another 2 hours. Well, at this point, depending on what stage you're in, which most people in stage 2 or 3, that cortisol shift will happen in a much shorter time period. You'll be an hour out from eating and within 90 minutes, you're getting cortisol release. And that's where I just ate, but I feel hungry and I get this weird anxiety feeling that comes in. The other symptom that a lot of people will have when they have low blood sugar issues is chronic headaches. Daily headaches that they can't manage and they don't know where they're coming from because it's like you're in a hypoglycemic state all the time. There's also some toxicity components that get kicked up with all of this, but we won't go that deep down the biochemistry. So why diet is so important in recovery and the kind of diet that's important in recovery is one that you stay ahead of the adrenals ever having to secrete cortisol. So one of the things I put everybody on isn't even so much what they're eating, but when they're eating, which is every 2 to 2.5 hours. And that's another sign of how bad is it. I had one client that she had to eat every 60 minutes. She was dealing with chronic headaches and adrenal fatigue. She was totally burned out. And if she ate something every hour all day long, she would have no headache. And that was our indicator. And then we slowly worked on it. And as she recovered, we knew she was recovering because she could go 90 minutes without eating. Then she'd go 2 hours without eating. And over about 6 to 9 months, we started expanding that timeline. Most people, I set it at 2.5 hours so that they for sure eat every 3 hours. So that 2 hour window that happens naturally, we're not going too much further than that. You want to stay ahead of your hunger curve because you want to give the adrenals a break. You want to let them rest. And one of the ways we let them rest is eating frequently throughout the day. But then there's the what we're eating. So the interesting thing is, a low carb diet, like the traditional low carb diets, mostly don't work for people with adrenal fatigue. There's a few metabolic types where they really do genuinely feel better on a carnivore or very carnivore-like paleo diet, but I never start anybody there. And when I have them do paleo, which is meat, fruit, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, I do take them off of grains. I do take them off of dairy because of the inflammatory component. And it's like, this goes to that question about food sensitivity and food allergies, which there is a difference between the two. Food allergies is an immune system response by immunoglobulins, which are your antibodies, called IgE, E as in an elephant. And IgE is an immediate reaction. Like if you get poison ivy, if you've got anaphylactic shock to something, people have peanut allergies, strawberry allergies. I have a shellfish allergy. That's all IgE, and that's considered medically an actual allergy. What most of us are dealing with around food is food sensitivity. It's not IgE immune system modulated. It might be IgG, which is delayed hypersensitivity. But even some of my clients, their IgG levels are low. And what they have is either complement cascade or inflammatory cascade or leukotrienes or prostaglandins or a whole bunch of other chemical names we won't go into, but they're all immune system mediators telling the body to attack a food thinking there's something wrong with it. We actually did a whole bit on leaky gut in the podcast with Zoe. So if you want to know where these sensitivities come from with leaky gut, go back to the podcast with Zoe because we talked about this. But what happens is like that's just another source of stress for the body to deal with in terms of that trauma response happening in the GI tract. Whenever we have a trauma response, if you break your arm, you cut your arm, or somebody yells at you, your body's going to respond with some degree of cortisol. So another way we get to calm things down and prevent the adrenals from having to fire very often is remove as many sources of injury or trauma, food sensitivities being one of them, but it also helps blood sugar balance. So we're kind of working the diet issue from both sides. So the number one thing is eating frequently throughout the day, like literally every 2.5 hours. Then the next thing is what you're eating. So I do take people, if they can do it, all the way off of grains, all the way off of dairy, and all the way off of most sugars. I've changed my tune a little bit about fruit. So people are probably happy about this. I think that there's actually a different kind of blood sugar response to fruit, whole fruit, not dried, not juiced, that our body does better with that than other sources. So especially in transition, when people are coming off of sugar from processed sources, I will be like, eat all the fruit you want. We'll deal with that later and see how that works for you. But often people in deep adrenal fatigue have to cut fruit out as well. Their body is just so sensitive to the sugars, and they'll tell me they can feel it in their body. They're like, if I eat fruit, I feel off. I feel anxious. I feel wired. It just doesn't sit well. So then what we eat is a lot of protein and a lot of fat. And there can be sweet potatoes, root vegetables, lots of plant-based starchy carbohydrates can be in there if that person needs it to balance out their energy levels. And that becomes a case-by-case basis. But what's most important is to have the protein and the fats. And it's like if you're burning a fire and you just constantly put paper on the fire and you're trying to keep it going with newspaper and you're trying to like roast a steak over a paper fire, even cardboard, it's not going to ever get hot enough and it's not going to ever last long enough. And you have to put so much energy into it. That is the equivalent of us living off of sugar, carbs, and processed food. So, which is one of the reasons people end up with adrenal issues. So what we want to shift towards is dense, nutrient dense proteins. I'm a big fan of red meat. I've talked a lot about it. I am a big fan of getting the healthiest meat sources you can afford. So organic is great. Grass-fed is better. Grass-fed, grass-finished from a local farmer that you know their name's Steve. That's the best. I literally have, I'm going to do a shameless plug for Glenwood Farms. This is my bison farmer in upstate New York, and I love him, and he's an awesome guy. And like he has an amazing bison CSA and tells me all about how they have a family farm, and you know they've been in business on these 250 acres for many generations. I think it's 4 or 5, it might even be 6 generations deep, and they raise bees and they raise bison, and they have this whole honey bison farm, and I'm like totally love it, right? So there's something for me that I think it even is more deeply nourishing when you have that relationship to it. Like this isn't just healthy chemical meat. This isn't just clean antibiotic free meat. It's Steve's meat. It's like I know the guy, and he actually said that if I buy into the CSA, I can come to a farm visit. So we'll totally do that, and I can go meet the animals and be a part of it, right? So having that protein building blocks. Now, how much? This is like the great debate of how much protein people need. A minimum, you take your body weight. So say you're 170 pounds, and the amount of protein you need would be grams of half your body weight. So that would be, do the math for me. Why does my brain not want to do this?
Oh gosh, now I'm a little.
I know, right? I usually do 150 and then it's really easy.
That is
75 grams.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know. I just picked that number. So you take half your body weight in grams is your minimum. There's a lot of different factors to how much protein people ultimately need. But here's the thing. When you're in recovery, this is not a time for dieting. This is not a time for trying. Now, some people do lose weight because we're reorganizing their fight, flight, or freeze. When your body is in survival, it will not lose weight. So once we start to calm the adrenal down, and once we get you on a blood sugar regulated diet, help you sleep deeper, the body finally is like, oh my God, I feel good. I feel safe. I can let the weight go. So it does happen, but it's not the focus. What we want to look at more is what's your hunger level, and are you staying ahead of that hunger curve? And you cannot overfeed this at this point. So I try and really encourage people to go nuts. This might be a full pound of meat a day. When I was in recovery, I mean, I was 25 at the time. So there was a certain metabolism focus, and I was in med school. So I had that high demand. But when I was in recovery from adrenal fatigue and I switched my diet to paleo, it was nuts how much meat I could consume. And I was like sausage and eggs for breakfast, and then ground beef tacos or burgers or whatever for lunch. And then I would have steak or pork chop or like, and I mean, I was blown away. And many of the other people around me, because there was a whole group of us that were like, oh, we all need to deal with this. They were dealing with the same thing. And it's interesting because in my clients, I'll see it'll last a certain period of time. And I say, do not restrict fat and do not restrict protein until you want to. Like, you'll just be amazed if you listen to your body, which is a big part of my practice, helping people listen to their bodies. But it won't last forever. It might be 3 months for some people. It might be a year that they eat that way. I knew one person where he literally woke up in the middle of the night, ate half of a steak, and went back to bed. Like, his cortisol in his body, like, it had such deep recovery that he needed to eat in the middle of the night. And he was losing, I mean, it was like not a weight issue, right? So grass-fed, grass-finished, pasture-raised, skin on, 80/20 marbled meat, lots of the best, healthiest fats for us are the fats from healthy animals. They have vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin D, they have omega-3s, they have all of these great nutrients that help restore our immune system and help our whole system begin to actually recover. So I'm going to pause myself there because I
Yeah,
can keep going.
great. That's great. And that brings up, there are a couple of things in there that I wanted to jump on. But right there, you just mentioned the nutrients, right? So one of the things I know for me when I was going through, when I was first diagnosed and really began focusing on my recovery, which because here's another piece we could talk about, how long it took me
Yeah.
to accept, to embrace what was going on. And then I was at a point where I actually did have to just stop
Everything. Yeah.
that probably took me 6 months to finally get that, oh, this was not something I could do along with everything else. I couldn't
Yeah.
make all those changes. But so we can talk about that too. But one of the things that showed up for me, you talked about being hungry. One of the struggles I had early on was I wasn't hungry. I had to force myself to eat. I remember our conversations about, like, I don't want to eat breakfast and what can I eat? Plus, I had so many of the dietary sensitivities that I had to take out, like the greens, and couldn't do eggs or dairy, so all of the
Yeah.
normal breakfast stuff was out anyway. And I remember you saying, grab a handful of almonds, just raw almonds, and a couple of dried apricots. And I had to force myself to eat that. And even eating every 2 hours, that's
It
another.
feels like a chore for most people. They
Yes,
don't like it.
yes.
I understand that. Yeah.
And another thing was also talking about, how much to eat, right? Like sometimes it could be just a handful of nuts every 2.
Right.
It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be
Have to be a
full,
big meal. No.
right? And then sometimes even doing smaller meals spread out throughout the day, just maintaining.
For a long time, I would make a full breakfast and then I'd eat half of it and I'd eat the other half 2.5 hours later. And like that would, I didn't, and it's actually really common that people will lose their appetite, particularly in the mornings. Like the idea of eating within an hour to 2 hours of waking up, they're like, no way. And there's a few tips and tricks around that. One is don't start with coffee because coffee suppresses your appetite and it raises your blood sugar. So then you don't feel like you need to eat. So you need the real food more than you need the coffee. The optimal time to drink coffee, which with adrenal fatigue is also another tricky one. Some people have to go off of caffeine altogether. It's just, it's too much of a stimulant that's continually pushing on those adrenal glands and they can't ever get the rest they need. Other people, they can do a little bit of caffeine because it is that double-edged sword of like, I can't get through my life without coffee, but at the same time, and that's one of the warning signs that maybe you should be taking more time off if you can't get through your life without the caffeine stimulation, because it can be very much raising uh what's the saying, the robbing Peter to pay Paul kind of a deal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that loss of appetite, I really get that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's the piece. Another piece you brought up, listening to your body. I know for me, that was such a revelation and took quite a while for me to learn how to listen to my body. I've gotten so good at it. And I'm still learning, right? I'm still learning. I mean, I think that probably also ties into, you mentioned early on, it's us, those who are driven. We give, whatever it's to. Yeah, yeah. And in giving, in being driven, we tend to ignore our bodies. We tend to ignore those signals because when I'm, when I have a work day that's 9 meetings or phone calls back to back to back to back to back, there's hardly time to go to the bathroom, let alone to eat or to to process any emotion that may have come up in something, whether it's anger or joy or frustration. Or so I've learned very early on that my needs don't matter, and that, and how I'm feeling doesn't, not that it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter.
It's
Or
irrelevant to the point of performance, whatever it is, whatever the task is at hand, whatever meeting needs to be accomplished. And society rewards that the way that, I mean, we've so much more awareness about this today than we did 15 years ago, but it's still baked in.
yes,
The rewards for being a workaholic, the accolades for going till 2 or 3 in the morning, like I've had founders as clients who literally are like, oh yeah, and I send out this email at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm like, yeah, you too, you're up, you're still doing, and it's like, and then when you actually are willing to start to get for yourself, I need to slow down and take time off, what people have to confront from partners, bosses, the society around them, the community, I still watch myself justifying that I'm only working a 40-hour work week because I had chronic fatigue syndrome 5 years ago and I got what my body's limits are. And yet I still have the brain pattern of like, I need to somehow justify, or that means something about who I am as a person.
yeah, all of that's huge. Let's talk a little bit about recovery. And in terms of listening to your body, I know one of the things that was huge for me was tracking. So yes, I am a spreadsheet person. So I created a spreadsheet with all the different things I wanted to track. And I, kept adding to those. One thing was, how much sleep did I get? How irritable am I? For me, when we first started, I had chronic earaches. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, and that was one of my canaries, so to speak, as I was recovering. One of the things I noticed was, oh, when my earaches start coming back, that was one of the signs that I needed to rest again. And so I was tracking that. I was tracking my digestion. I was tracking um, uh, headaches and dizziness and all of that, and how often I was eating, blood sugar. So, so tracking, I think, is, and whether you do it in a spreadsheet or in notes, there was another time.
There's actually a bunch of apps now like this. Fortunately, we have so many people with chronic fatigue that there's like whole births of apps out there for this kind of symptom tracking. There's a new wearable device. I'm trying to remember the name of it right now, that it's basically like any of the sports watches that'll tell you, your step count and whatever, except the way that they interpret the information is actually to tell you if you need to rest and slow down. So it's all kind of, instead of telling you you're ready to work out, you're ready to exercise, it's like you're ready for a nap, you need to sleep for 12 hours. So it's geared towards people in recovery of, these long viral infections, Epstein-Barr, cytomegalovirus, Lyme's disease, COVID, people dealing with, ME-CFS, people dealing with mold toxicity, people dealing with adrenal, fatigue issues, like that whole realm of complex chronic illness, even post cancer treatment,
Mm.
fantastic that you got through the cancer. And now you got to rebuild your immune system, your energy system. Many people deal with insomnia, fungal infections, gut problems, skin problems. There's a whole impact to the adrenals of chemotherapy and radiation and cancer treatment. And just the being a person dealing with cancer in the medical system pretty much guarantee that their adrenals are going to be out of whack by the end of all of that, and something to focus on healing. So yeah, that's definitely a huge piece. So what did you find were some of the most useful things to track?
Sleep,
Mm-hmm.
definitely. So how much I was sleeping a night, what were my insomnia days, and when, because that was one thing that I dealt with as we went through the cycles, was not falling asleep until 2, 3, 4, sometimes 6 a.m., even though I was tired, but my body just wouldn't sleep. So, following those, definitely what I was eating and what you were talking about, of as I was improving, did I still, how long could I go between eating? Not that I was tending to, right? But after 6 months, 9 months, realizing like, oh, I forgot to eat at my 2.5 hour mark. And here it is, 3.5 hours. And oh, wow, I didn't get brain fog. I was brain fog. That was something I definitely tracked. How bad was my brain fog, and whether it was brain fog, ability to focus, ability to concentrate, memory issues. They can all be, to start out, you just lump them together. Eventually you can separate them out because they can guide you to different aspects, right? But starting out, just what was my brain fog levels? And in terms of brain fog, people might ask, well, what does that mean? On my really bad brain fog days, I would go grocery shopping. I would have my list. I would walk into the grocery store and I would take 10 steps in, and I would stop and have to look at my list and think, okay, what do I need? Okay, vegetables. All right, so I'm going toward produce. 10 steps in, I'd have to stop again. Literally,
Yeah.
every 30 seconds, I was stopping and looking at my list to figure out where I was going and why. Because
Complex decision making, like one decision attached to another decision attached to another. Like, I'm in the grocery store. I'm here for food. What food am I here for? Where is that food located? Where do I need to go to get that food? What sequence do I need to walk around the grocery store? That already is like too much. Yeah. When I was in the peak, I mean, I realized I shouldn't be driving when this happened, but when I was in the peak of my chronic fatigue, I couldn't drive the car, operate the car, and look at the instructions for the directions on my phone. I would have to pull over, figure out what the next couple moves were on my phone, drive them, and then pull over again to do it because I couldn't go back and forth and frame switch driving and operating the car, paying attention to traffic. And yes, very quickly after that happened one time, going a few miles away from my house, I was like, I'm not getting a car anymore until it got
Right.
better.
Right. Yeah, that was one thing for me too, is learning those days of, I can't do anything today. Right. Whether it's focus or dizziness. I definitely, for me, dizziness is another, as I no longer have the earache. So yay, we finally finally healed that. That only
Yeah.
took like 8 years. But for me, dizziness is a big indicator of where my adrenal fatigue is. And so that's definitely something I kept track of. How bad was I dizzy just on standing? Did it happen just once or twice during a day, or was it all day long? And those are big indicators
Yeah.
for me that, oh, I need to rest. And of course, rest we can talk a lot about. Yeah, but also the digestion, right? Like, was I dealing with constipation or diarrhea? How, what was going on that way? How much I was drinking, my water intake, and I was I drinking the right amount? So that was another thing for me. My gut was so messed up that I was drinking too much water and I wasn't giving my gut enough time to absorb my nutrients. So I actually had to reduce my water intake and make sure that at least a third of my fluid intake was electrolytes.
Yeah. Which
So,
I've now changed my tune on that, which is if anyone's in adrenal recovery or any kind of chronic fatigue situation, all water all the time has sea salt or electrolytes in it. Like I just not even bother with pure water. I mean, filtered to begin with, right? But it really does help. Then they find they don't actually have to do 96 ounces of water a day. We're doing 64, 72 ounces for most people, and it's getting in and it's as effective. So I've definitely, but back then I was saying at least the first liter, the first quart of water every day to have electrolytes, and lemon juice and sea salt or electrolytes. And, ideally we don't even have stevia or other sweeteners in it because that can cause some problems with our gut microbiome and our insulin. But, we can work that out to each person. One thing I want to put in, just you can share this, but you've been on this journey for a long time and it hasn't just been adrenal fatigue.
yes.
Because I don't want people to be like, what do you mean it's going to take me 10
Right,
years,
right,
right?
right.
This is a big question, which is how long does it take to heal?
Yes.
And it's one hand completely, it depends, right? What stage of adrenal fatigue are you in and how long have you been there is a big factor. But then there's also what is the willingness to actually alter your life, because most of the recovery doesn't start until you reach a certain tipping point where you're like, you talked about that surrender to, okay, I really have to do this. Not everybody needs to actually leave job or work, but some people do. And typically for my standard type 2 stage 2 adrenal fatigue, we haven't gone into exhaustion, we're just kind of hanging out in some dysfunction. I tend to extend my timelines because I really want people in a permanent state of health, not just feeling better. So I usually say it's going to take 6 months to get you to a place where you feel significantly better, and it's going to take a year to anchor you there. If somebody's in stage 3, even for a relatively short period of time, it's a minimum of a year, but not a year to feel better. That's not the same thing. It's just that the work we're doing here is not detox to retox. It's not, let me prop you back up on your feet so you can go burn yourself out again in 6 months, right? Like, because that's what a lot of us, how we ended up there in the first place was we went into stage 2 and then we went back. We went into stage 2 and we went back. Oh, we dipped into stage 3 for a while. And we were like, what was that weird year? And then we come back out of it, And then at some point, many of us go into complete crash or total failure where the body is just literally like, oh, I'm sorry. Did you think you were going to live your life? No, you're not. You're going to deal with this now.
Yeah. And no, that's great. Right. So that was what happened to me. I said, looking back, it was age 22 when I had my first adrenal crash. And I kind of naturally would take some time off. I would push. For me, it was my first year of graduate school. And I have a PhD in physics, so I was pushing and pushing and pushing. And so at the end of that first year into that first summer, I actually was able to only work 8 hours a day, or 9 instead of 16 when I didn't have classes. And I was finally getting out and doing some hiking and some biking. And so I was starting to do all those things to recover that I didn't even know it was what I was supposed to be doing, but I did. And another thing, I was in therapy. Going back to, we've mentioned trauma a few times. We can talk about that, or maybe there'll be a whole other episode on trauma. So I had been going through the cycles of adrenal fatigue for 22 years. One of the things that, as I began learning about this, I love analogies. Analogies are such a great way. Not only, you've been using analogies about what's going on in the body, but one of the things I've discovered is trying to explain this to other people. So, like, what's happening? What does it feel like? What's the experience? And one of the things for me that I discovered is, if you think about bending metal, even just take a paper clip, right? You stretch it out and then you just start playing with it, and you're playing with it and it's fine and it goes back, and then suddenly it snaps. And for me, that's one of the analogies I came up with
Mm.
was for 22 years, I was going through bending the metal, going into some level of adrenal fatigue, stage 1, 2, well into 3, and back again, sometimes for years at a time, sometimes for months at a time, and back. And I could straighten that metal out and straighten that metal out. And then for whatever reason it was at 44, I broke. It just broke. Yes. So for one thing, that's another question I had for you is, and we could talk about acute fatigue versus adrenal fatigue versus this chronic, those of us who go through cycles and cycles. So in that, it took us about probably a good 3.5 years because I was so deep into the adrenal fatigue and I had so many cycles of it before we really got into a stable point. And then, well, so to speak. And then at that point, we were able to actually start discovering what else was going on in my body. So it was at that point when, like, no, we're no pretty sure that the adrenal fatigue is under control. Let me
Yeah.
put it that way, right? And I do want to say I don't have adrenal fatigue issues for 11 years consistently. For me, it's cyclic, and I've learned what triggers it, when I can push what, when certain symptoms come back, and I haven't gone into that stage 3 or even very far into stage 2 anymore because I've learned how to listen to my body, learned how to take the time off, learned how to recover. So there's that piece. But for me, I also have ME-CFS. And so we began learning about that once we got to that stable point. But then there was this other set of symptoms that were persisting. And so at that point, we started looking for the Epstein-Barr and we started looking for what else was going on. And then I had an acute, just as we were getting that handled, I had an acute mold exposure and ended up with mold toxicity. So for the last 3 years, I've been in a major detox and learning about that aspect, and then how the ME-CFS comes into play with the detox and the toxicity recovery, and then also how the adrenals and the adrenal fatigue
Because
play.
we are hormone soup.
And
Yeah.
and it's stressors, right?
Yeah.
That's another thing that, as I share about this and talk to people who are struggling with fatigue and don't know yet what they have, and if it's adrenal fatigue or not, and if it is adrenal fatigue, is it the primary issue they're dealing with? Like, have they had an acute stressor that focused on that, or is it secondary? Like you said, is it the thyroid um, that then hit into the adrenal issues? Are they dealing with something like cancer or cancer recovery? That then there's so much stress on the body for whatever reason that the adrenal glands are now also becoming compromised, or the
Yep.
HPA-Axis.
Launching a business,
A,
having gone through a big, growth spurt. That's often when some of these things come out.
a major
Like, yeah, I mean, going back to school later on in life and deciding to get a graduate degree or a PhD and having to push yourself through that kind of an intense mental process. When I have people come to me and they decide they're going to go to graduate school, we're doing preventative adrenal care all the way through the entire time to do as much caretaking to prevent there being a crash on the other side. One of the things you mentioned is the difference between acute and chronic, and it, without pulling up a bunch of resources, I don't have like the best most, but I'm going to give it another analogy, where many of us have had that experience either in school or around maybe a period of time in our work life where we had some big project. In school would be like you have your semester of school and you're under the grindstone, you're working and studying, or you're at work and you have like say a 10-week period until a big project is going to be complete, and you're pushing, and then there's always that like crescendo at the end, which is either finals or the end of the project where everything has to be delivered and handled. And it's like you feel pretty good through the process. You're handling it, you're doing it. And then it's over and you're in that break between semesters, or you're at the end of the project and things are quiet for a little bit and you get sick. And it's like it was just waiting in the background for you to have the time and ability. And actually, one of the things cortisol does in the body is suppresses immune system function. So short term, if you're running from the bear, or you just got in a car accident, or you have, a ski accident and you busted your knee, the cortisol raises to get you through that immediate, oh fuck situation. It shunts everything away from your digestive tract. You stop using your digestive tract. It shunts things away from your immune system, because dealing with a cold or a flu is not your major issue if you just broke your leg. And it promotes increased levels of, your pulse goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your fast twitch muscles work better, your brain sharpens and focuses. There's a bunch of other neurotransmitters involved as well, but cortisol is a big part of it, in order to get you through that immediate stress response, which in most of these situations, that stress response should be over in 24 to 36 hours. And many people who have had something where they broke their leg or they busted their knee or some sort of acute injury will actually say, I didn't even start to feel the pain until like 24 to 36 or 48 hours later. Well, that was because cortisol and your opiates and all of your neurotransmitters were protecting you until you got away from the problem long enough that then it all starts to set in. And when I have somebody that's had cyclical adrenal issues and they do have an injury like that, they can feel really horrible after all that wears off. And it's like they go down to this deep, dark place and everything feels very ungrounded, because they already were dealing with struggles with their adaptive adrenal stress response. So that's what the acute situation mostly looks like. But again, when it's been sustained for long periods of time, and one of the ways from a laboratory test, the way we can tell is that peak we talked about in the labs at the beginning, the more that starts to flatten out, the longer I know that they've been dealing with this. And I have some people where it's dead flat, and others where there's just a little tiny blip that happens in the morning. And that's when it's like your adrenals are still working. You do not have Addison's disease. You're not an adrenal failure. There's not actually a need to put you on, prednisone or a steroid in order to maintain your cortisol levels. But you are having very little response first thing in the morning, getting up and going. The adrenals just literally don't have it in them to secrete very much. And then we know it's going to be a long recovery. And it depends on how much somebody changes their lifestyle and what else is going on, whether it's cyclical or whether it's something that is like, if you just take this all the way, you can be done with it and complete. But mostly, like, I like your metal analogy. Let's even say that we just have this weak point that didn't fully snap, but that weak point is probably going to be weak. And it's like, I almost don't even want to use the word weak, because we associate that with like something's wrong with us. We shouldn't be this way. Another way of looking at it is, we have a society that is designed to burn out your adrenals.
Mm.
Food, work demands, the way that we've invented the nuclear family, where you're no longer multi-generation raising your children. You don't have neighborhoods of moms and dads all around supporting the raising of your children. And so you're working, you have a career, you're raising your children, you're figuring out money, you're dealing with chemical stresses, you're dealing with fast food, you're dealing with not having the right nutrients, you have whatever trauma you had from your childhood that you're still operating inside of. I mean, it is a recipe. That's why you were like, how do you know if you should get tested? I'm like, you're an American. Pretty much guarantee right there. Or you're living in a highly westernized society, But what are those things that help ground us, that help us recover? Time outside, being in nature at all. And for many people in deep fatigue, I just get them outdoors first thing in the morning. Sunlight touching their retinas will burn off the melatonin from the night and will begin to stimulate your diurnal cortisol rhythms to start to recover. So even if it's just the difference between I sit on my couch and I drink coffee, or I sit on my veranda just outside the door, I don't do anything. I'm not even telling you to go for a walk. Just be outdoors and let natural sunlight, even on a cloudy day, hit the back of your eyes, and spend ideally a half an hour, but even 10 minutes will start to make a difference. And the more time you spend in nature, the faster you'll recover. That's a huge one that's cheap and easy. You just have to be willing to go outdoors. Looking at something green will start to make a difference for putting your nervous system back into calm, safe, parasympathetic, allowing your body to come back into that resonance. So there's some things that don't have to be super complex, but many times people that I know that are dealing with long-term recovery naturally find they just can't deal with the busyness of the city. They don't want to be around that many people. They can't, going to the grocery store is overwhelming, right? We talked about that. So if they have to, moving during chronic fatigue or adrenal fatigue is not easy to do, as you and I both know. But my move out of the busy suburbs of Salt Lake City to the countryside of Western New York, where I was literally living in a farmhouse looking at a farm all day long, I was bored to tears. I did not know exactly what I was doing in this big house by myself, but I'm certain that was a critical piece of my recovery. So I'm clear we're going to need multiple chapters for this one because there's so much more. But I think that this is a good moment to bring it together for now. And yeah, I mean, you have such a wealth to give about what it is to stay on this journey. And so I look forward to being able to ask you more questions and hear more about how you've managed all of this and worked through it. And I think we've done a pretty good start here.
I think so. Yeah, this is great. Good conversation and just, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest take homes I want people to have about this is if you go to your doctor with fatigue or you don't feel right and their only answer is antibiotics, is antidepressants, or nowadays they'll at least go to maybe, hormone replacement therapy, which I'm glad we're having that conversation, but I think it gets had too soon. I will not consider estrogen or testosterone in particular, progesterone, it depends, in anybody until we've seriously evaluated their blood sugar, their blood pressure, their adrenal glands, and how their cortisol levels are doing. If that resilience is in, you'll do that much better on the hormone replacement therapy. But it's like, this is a huge conversation to keep alive for people, and to also recognize you're not crazy. One of the things you say all the time is,
Yes.
You're not lazy.
You're not,
right? That's not that thing of I just don't have the willpower. Oh, I just don't, no, there's something else operating that you should, and the good news is still today, if you take the term adrenal fatigue to most doctors, they're going to tell you it doesn't exist. I don't know why they're so adamantly against that conversation, but HPA-Axis dysfunction, they have to grapple with that one. And it's far more commonly accepted and understood, especially, quite frankly, in this post-COVID era, because so many people are dealing with issues from long COVID and post-COVID syndrome and even post-vaccine injury. And, this whole world has opened up quite a bit in the last 5 years in a way that you and I did not have access to when we were dealing with it in the beginning.
Absolutely.
Any final words of wisdom for somebody on this journey?
Patience. Patience and love yourself. Bring love. We talk about, do you love your life? Do you love yourself? And love often seems like, oh, everything's great. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of what is love, love is surrounding what's broken. And so I would say bring love to yourself and to this process. Accept who you are. Be willing to be quiet, be willing to be still. And yeah, it's and be patient.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. And remember,
so good.
You're not crazy, you're not lazy. There's something really going on. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jennifer, as always, it is such a joy and a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for trusting me on your journey and your contribution here. This is going to be really useful for a lot of people.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Until we get to do it again.
All right.
Thank you for being here. This conversation is your invitation to remember that healing can be messy, hard work, and also beautiful. Stay connected. Join my newsletter at sarahmarshallnd.com or through the link in the show notes. Until next time, keep asking the questions that matter, and you will find your own path to healing. And of course, a special thanks to my extraordinary and generous guests, my producer, Joshua Watherston, video editing by Nellie Dawson, artistic graphical design by Amy Pruitt, and music by Roddy Nickpour. And as always, thank you for being here.